Revenge is a fluid and toxic mercury, moving through the veins of our characters until it finally reaches its deadly destination. Experience the high-tension drama of a final reckoning that no one saw coming in the dark. Click subscribe now and see the ultimate price of a life.
Smiled when he handed me the envelope, not a polite smile. The kind that says, I already won and you don't know it yet. That smile lived rent-free in my head for the next 6 days, until my attorney read page 11. I'd been with the company for 9 years. 9 years of hitting quota, mentoring junior reps, flying out to client sites in cities I can't even pronounce anymore. I came in as a regional account manager and worked my way up to director of strategic partnerships. That title sounds impressive. What it actually meant was that I was the person who kept our 3 largest clients from walking out the door every time our ops team dropped the ball, which was often. The founder's son came on board about 14 months before all of this happened. His official title was Chief Growth Officer. Nobody really knew what that meant, including him. What it meant in practice was that he sat in on meetings he hadn't been invited to, seed himself on email threads after the fact, and slowly started making decisions that weren't his to make. He had the energy of someone who'd read 2 chapters of a leadership book and decided that was enough. I want to be fair. He wasn't incompetent across the board. He had ideas. Some of them were even good. But there's a difference between having ideas and having authority, and he never quite grasped that distinction. He thought proximity to the founder's last name was the same thing as earning a seat at the table. For the first few months, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. We all did. He was young. He was eager. He was also the founder's son, so there was a ceiling on how much pushback anyone was willing to offer. I stayed in my lane, did my work, kept my clients happy. Then he started touching my accounts, not officially. Nothing was ever official with him. It was always a casual mention in a hallway, a text message that read more like a memo, a quick sync that turned into him explaining to me how he thought I should be managing a relationship I'd been managing since before he graduated college. My contact at one of our anchor clients actually called me one afternoon and said, "Hey, I got a call from someone at your company I've never heard of. Should I be worried?" I told her no. I lied. I raised it with my direct supervisor. She nodded a lot and said she'd look into it. Nothing changed. I raised it again 3 months later. She told me the situation was being managed at a higher level. I didn't know what that meant, but I had a feeling it wasn't good for me. I wasn't wrong. On a Tuesday morning in October, I got a calendar invite for a meeting with no agenda and no other attendees listed besides my supervisor and someone from HR. Anyone who's ever worked in an office knows what that meeting is. I spent the 45 minutes between the invite and the meeting time cleaning out the personal files on my work laptop and forwarding 2 things to my personal email: my original employment contract and a document I'd quietly held on to for years that I'll get to in a moment. The meeting was exactly what I knew it would be. My supervisor sat across from me with her hands folded on the table like she was posing for a portrait. The HR director, who I'd maybe spoken to 3 times in 9 years, sat to her left. The founder's son was not in the room, which I noted. People who are confident in what they're doing usually show up to watch. My supervisor told me the company was restructuring the strategic partnerships function. She said my role was being eliminated. She used the word unfortunately 4 times in 90 seconds. I counted because it gave me something to do other than let my face do things I'd regret. Then the HR director slid a manila envelope across the table. She said it contained my severance package and that their legal team had reviewed everything thoroughly. She said the terms were straightforward. She said it was important that I understand the NDA component before I left the building. And then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, she said, this protects both parties, and smiled in a way that made it very clear she believed it only protected one. The package was 2 months base salary. I'd been there 9 years, 2 months. There was also a non-disparagement clause that was, I'll give them credit, unusually broad. I wasn't supposed to say anything negative about the company, its leadership, its products, or its business practices to anyone, including, and this was a specific carve-out that someone had clearly written with intent, any current or former clients or vendors. The implication was obvious. I had relationships. They wanted to make sure I couldn't use them. I asked if that was their final offer. The HR director said yes, the terms were fixed. I picked up the envelope. I put it in my bag. I said, I'll have my attorney take a look. The HR director's expression shifted just slightly, not quite a frown, not quite surprise, somewhere in between. My supervisor said that was absolutely my right, but that the offer did expire in 5 business days. I left the building without stopping at my desk. I'd already taken everything I needed. I should explain the document. When I first joined the company, I was 31 and it was my first director-level role. I was excited and a little naive, and I also happened to have a friend who was a contracts attorney who insisted on reading my employment agreement before I signed it. I will never stop being grateful for that. She flagged a few things. Most of them were standard, she said, just worth understanding. But one clause she found interesting, a confidentiality provision that bound me from disclosing certain proprietary information. She said, "This is pretty one-sided. If you're going to agree to this, you should ask for reciprocal language." I almost didn't. I thought pushing back on my employment contract before my first day would send the wrong signal. My friend told me that was exactly the kind of thinking that kept people from protecting themselves. She drafted a reciprocity clause, one that applied the same confidentiality and non-disparagement obligations to the company that it was placing on me. And she added a penalty provision. Any breach by either party would trigger liquidated damages equal to 3 times the value of whatever benefit the breaching party sought to gain. The company's legal team at the time barely batted an eye. It was buried in an amendment on page 11. They signed it. I kept a copy. And then 9 years went by, and I mostly forgot it existed. Until that Tuesday in October. My attorney is someone I found through a friend of a friend of a friend about 4 years ago when I was dealing with a lease dispute that turned into something more complicated than expected. I'd kept her number. She does employment law now, among other things. And when I called her the afternoon I was let go, she told me to bring everything I had. I sat across from her the next morning with the severance envelope, my original employment contract, the amendment, and a folder of emails I'd saved over the past year documenting the founder's son's interference in my accounts. I'd kept those emails for my own peace of mind, never thinking I'd actually use them. I told myself I was being paranoid. My attorney read through everything quietly for about 20 minutes. I sat there and drank the coffee she'd offered me and tried not to watch her face for clues. Then she looked up and said, "They've already violated your contract before you even signed the severance." I asked her what she meant. She turned to the amendment, page 11, and pointed to the reciprocity clause. Then she opened the folder of emails I'd brought. She pointed to an email from the founder's son to the VP of sales at one of my clients, sent 6 weeks before I was fired, in which he had described my management of that account as not aligned with our current strategic direction. She pointed to a Slack message export I'd included, one I'd screenshotted after a colleague forwarded it to me, in which the founder's son had told the head of client success that I was resistant to change and probably not the right fit long term. That message had been sent to a group that included 2 external contractors. She said, "This is disparagement, and it went to vendors and external parties, which is exactly what your clause covers. They did to you what they're now trying to prohibit you from doing to them." I sat with that for a second. She kept going. She told me the non-disparagement clause in the severance they'd offered me was, ironically, the thing that sealed it, by presenting me with a one-sided NDA and framing it as standard when they had already been in breach of the reciprocal agreement I'd signed 9 years ago. They had compounded the violation. She used the phrase negotiating in bad faith. She said it twice. Then she got to the numbers. The liquidated damages provision in my amendment was tied to the value of the benefit the breaching party sought to gain. In their case, the benefit they sought to gain by disparaging me to my clients was, arguably, the preservation of those client relationships. Our 3 anchor clients represented, combined, a little over $2 million in annual contract value. The founder's son's communications had been directed at decision makers at 2 of those 3 clients, 3 times the value of what they stood to gain or protect. That was the formula. My attorney said she'd need to do more work on the exact calculation, but her initial read put us somewhere in the range of $600,000 to over $1 million, depending on how the damages were argued. And that was before attorney's fees, which the amendment also addressed. The prevailing party in any dispute was entitled to recover reasonable legal costs. I asked her what our next step was. She said, "I'm going to write them a letter. I won't pretend the next 2 weeks were easy." I second-guessed myself constantly. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning running through scenarios where I was wrong, where my attorney was wrong, where I'd end up spending money I didn't have on a fight I couldn't win. I'd get up and make coffee and sit at my kitchen table and read back through everything and then feel better and then feel scared again. My sister was the only person I told. She asked me approximately once a day whether I was doing okay and exactly 0 times whether I was sure about the decision. She understood without being told that I'd already made my choice. My attorney sent the letter on a Monday. By Wednesday afternoon, she had a call request from the company's outside counsel. She briefed me afterward. She said the call was short. The outside counsel had clearly been handed the file that morning because he kept asking for time to review provisions she was referencing by page and paragraph number. She said at one point he put her on hold for 4 minutes. When he came back, he asked if her client would be open to a settlement conversation. She told him her client would listen to any offer that reflected the full scope of the contractual exposure. I got a call from my attorney 8 days later. She'd had 2 more calls with outside counsel and one with someone she believed to be their CFO, though he'd been introduced only as a financial representative. She told me they'd made an offer. It was not a good offer. It was the original 2-month severance plus a bump to 5 months and a one-time payment she described as a goodwill gesture. She said she'd told them that wasn't a serious number and that if they weren't willing to engage with the actual contractual exposure, we'd file. I asked if she thought we should file. She said, "I think they're going to come back." She was right. They came back 3 days later with a new number, $245,000, inclusive of the original severance, structured as a lump sum. She told them no. She sent over a detailed calculation of damages based on the client contract values in the specific communications we'd documented. She cited the attorney's fees provision. She gave them a response deadline. They met the deadline. The final number was $608,000, plus attorney's fees, separately negotiated, which brought the total disbursement from their side to just under $700,000. My attorney's cut came out of the damages award per our arrangement. What landed in my bank account was enough to cover a full year without working, and then some, enough to take a breath, reassess, and figure out what I actually wanted to do next. The wire came through on a Friday morning. I was still in my pajamas. I looked at my phone, looked at the number, set the phone down, and went and made breakfast. Real breakfast, the kind I never made on workday mornings. Eggs, toast, the good coffee from the bag I'd been saving. I sat by the window and ate alone and thought about that smile in the conference room. The one that said, "I already won, and you don't know it yet." He wasn't wrong about the first part. He had won in the narrow sense. I no longer had the job, the title, the benefits, the team I'd spent years building. Those things were gone, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't cost me something real. But there's a version of winning that looks like getting everything you wanted and still ending up on the wrong side of the math. I'd started to think that's actually the more dangerous kind, the kind where you never see it coming because you stopped looking after the first move. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't come into that Tuesday meeting with a strategy. I had a contract I'd almost not asked for, drafted by a friend who insisted I protect myself before I'd even started. I had a folder of emails I'd saved out of habit and mild resentment. I had an attorney I called because I didn't know what else to do. What I had more than anything was a piece of paper on page 11 that someone signed without reading carefully enough. I never called my former clients to say a word about what happened. I didn't need to. 3 of them reached out to me within the first month. They'd noticed the transition, noticed the change in responsiveness, noticed whatever story they'd been told didn't quite add up. 2 of them asked if I was available for consulting work. I told them I was taking some time, maybe after the new year. Maybe then. For now, I have a kitchen window and a bag of good coffee and absolutely nowhere I need to be before 9. That's enough. I think about that Tuesday a lot, not with bitterness, but with something closer to clarity. There's a version of that day where I walk out of the conference room, take the 2 months, sign the NDA, and move on. Most people would have. I almost did, and if I had, nobody would have blamed me. Sometimes you're tired. Sometimes the fight doesn't feel worth the cost of fighting. I understand that. I've been that person in smaller moments throughout my career. The meeting where I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. The email I softened when I should have sent it straight. You make those choices and you tell yourself it's strategy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. Wearing strategy's clothes. What saved me wasn't luck. It was a decision I made at 31 that I barely remember making. My friend sat across from me with my employment contract and said, "Protect yourself before you start." And I almost didn't listen. I almost let the excitement of a new job and the anxiety of making a good impression talk me out of asking for what was fair. That impulse, the one that says don't push, don't ask, don't seem difficult, is one of the most expensive impulses a person can have. Doing right by yourself isn't the same as being difficult. Asking for reciprocal terms in a contract isn't aggression, it's just honesty applied in both directions. The company wasn't wrong to protect its interests. They were wrong to assume I didn't have the same right. That asymmetry, the one they'd been counting on for 9 years without knowing it, was the thing that undid them. And here's what I keep coming back to. They didn't lose because they were unlucky. They lost because someone got lazy. Someone saw the amendment on page 11, decided it was boilerplate, and signed without reading. Someone sent those Slack messages and those emails without thinking about what they'd already agreed to on paper. When you operate from arrogance, when you assume the other person in the room doesn't know what you know, hasn't prepared what you've prepared, won't push back the way you wouldn't, you stop being careful. And the moment you stop being careful is the moment you start making the kind of mistakes that cost you $700,000. I didn't win because I was smarter than them. I won because I stayed steady when it would have been easier not to. I kept the emails, I kept the contract. I made the call to my attorney when everything in me wanted to just let it go and grieve the job quietly. That steadiness, that refusal to let the worst moment of a bad week be the thing that made my decision for me, is the only thing I can actually take credit for. My sister asked me a few weeks after the wire came through whether I felt like I'd gotten justice. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, I feel like I got the outcome that was always available to me. I just didn't walk away from it. That's the thing nobody tells you about situations like this. The outcome doesn't change based on how wronged you feel or how much you deserve better. It changes based on whether you prepared, whether you held on to what mattered, and whether you had the patience to let the process work instead of collapsing the moment someone put an envelope on a table and smiled like the conversation was already over. The coffee is still good. The window is still there, and I still have a copy of page 11.